The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
China's President Xi Jinping secured a third term for himself at the recently concluded Party Congress and packed the government with his loyalists. Dan Rosen of the Rhodium Group tells us what happened and what it means for the world economy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Exchange. I'm Pete Sweeney. I'll be hosting this episode, and I'm chatting with Dan Rosen, who's now a partner at the Rhodium Group. He's a former White House policy advisor and generally considered a top China policy wonk, if I may. And we're going to be chatting about what just happened at China's unusually dramatic Party Congress, which concluded last weekend. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Pete, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Before we get started, just so you don't have to waste your time repeating yourself, I'm just going to lay out some of the basics for our listeners, and then we'll get into it. First, I'm going to explain what these congresses are. So there are two types of entities that are involved in the governance of the People's Republic of China. The first is the government institutions, the bureaucracies, and the regulatory institutions. The second is the Chinese Communist Party structure that stands behind all of this. And in a single party state, the party structure is more important than the government. And it's become even more so under President Xi Jinping. These party congresses are held every 5 years, and they're major events that ultimately dictate how the government is run and who runs it. And this one was a bit of a humdinger. They've often been kind of sleepy affairs as far as foreigners are concerned. But this one was quite exciting. We had a scene in which the former president, Hu Jintao, appeared to be escorted out of the event without any explanation as cameras rolled. Anyways, without getting too further into that, Dan, this was presented as a major test of Xi Jinping's ability to consolidate his power and further redefine his role upward. In your view, how did he do? How do you score his progress on that front?
Well, I think if there was any debate about whether he was this concentrated, centralized, executive-style leader, in contrast to the old the post-Mao Chinese approach of a committee structure to avoid, the risk that the too much power could be in one person's hands. If there was any debate about that, that debate is now, over and set aside. All the indications of what the most sort of concentrated outcome would be are what eventuated, or what we saw in terms of the structure of the new standing committee of the Politburo, in terms of all the choreography, all those sorts of things. And then the little hiccup where former President General Secretary Hu left the building, even all sort of presented this picture of a clear concentration of power in Xi Jinping for in political terms anyway.
So a lot of people, there's a debate over what this means. I mean, so Xi kind of when he first came into power, was seen as this kind of no-name guy, the tool of a faction that was worried about eroding credibility of the Chinese Communist Party among the new generations of Chinese people. That just sort of drift into corruption, into capitalism, and that he was just this kind of like guy that got shoveled into position, not a particularly charismatic guy, and that therefore he had to do all this tough spade work to kind of consolidate his authority. And so there's been people have been making kind of excuses saying, well, he hasn't done reform, he hasn't been doing these things because he's insecure, and before he gets around to do all these wonderful things we expect him to do, he's going to have to protect his back. Now we've had 10 years of Xi, now we're about to have another 5. And people are saying, well, now, with this dramatic, absolutely stuffing the cabinet, the standing committee with his supporters, this kind of extraordinary sidelining of people who are just not really opponents, but just kind of critics or more pro-market people, that he is now free to do these things that people want him to do. For example, relax about the COVID-0 policy, where he's trying to kind of basically protect a population of 1.4 billion from ever catching COVID-19, which is ambitious, to put it mildly, and has had these huge economic impact from this crackdown on real estate. I mean, depending on how you view this crackdown as a good thing or a bad thing, but, is he going to relax the pressure on property developers that has kind of put this major contributor to economic growth sliding sideways and downwards? Other people think, well, now he's powerful enough, he's going to go after Taiwan and start World War III. Yeah. Where do you stand on this?
So I've long thought that that line of analysis was, as the Chinese say, drawing a snake and adding feet to it, which is to say that close on 10 years ago, it was already abundantly clear that Xi Jinping was not the sort of empty vessel, or a sort of thinly armored vehicle that was going to need to spend a lot of time shoring up its defenses and strength. From pretty early on in his initial term, after his 2012-2013 investment of the leadership authority, he took charge of all the small leading groups, took charge of the discipline process, started cracking down on any possible future opponents in a way that, left me with no doubt that this was somebody who knew how to use the reins of power, had a clear plan of intention. And then, of course, at Rhodium, we really only follow the economic side with sort of a professional grade intensity, although we spend a lot of time with our colleagues from the domains of politics and security, et cetera, to make sure we're not missing things. But in the economic lane, I mean, what was most striking to me was how comprehensive and audacious the 2013 economic reform program he put down on the table was, the so-called 60 decisions, not so-called, but called 60 decisions. And, it was unambiguous in its intention to really put a new stamp on the way the economy functioned, its relationship to the state, its relationship to the party. And it was actually a bit more modern and market-oriented than many people expected at the time. So, that speaks to independent thought, ability to, embrace a program that is not conventional by modern Chinese People's Republic of China standards, frankly. And that, of course, now we look back and we see that he was not able to implement that agenda effectively. It created too much instability, and he sort of veered off in other directions since then, which we can talk about if you want. But the main takeaway from that was that this was a kind of transformative leader, not somebody in the tradition of just sort of, being a steward of the party's interests during his tenure and then passing it on to the next guy. This is someone who had ideas about really reshaping the system fundamentally.
We had the language about, putting the market in charge of pricing. And I think at that point, and you had the appointment of people like Liu He, Guo Shiqing, or the elevation, at least, of these people. A lot of these English-speaking people who, Yi Gang, the head of the governor of the central bank, is, Western educated. A lot of these so-called Haigui, the sea turtles, these people that had experience in overseas markets, were kind of, at least appeared to be elevated into positions of power. And certainly, I think from the economic reform perspective, you can at least rate them on their push to deleverage the economy, to get to eradicate some of the deep systemic financial risk, right? But on balance, you kind of rate. I mean, and you've written that, and you just said that he's more of a failure at economic reform than somebody who is a resistant to it, or like a Maoist who's trying to recollectivize agriculture or whatever. But he's tried to do something and failed at it. Can you just go into a bit more detail there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly from 2013 to 2016, maybe 17, you could say, it was a more complicated story, with him trying to find a way to have it both ways, if you will, both have greater party discipline over all things, greater state and party optionality, if you will, to pull on whatever levers they wanted to for political and geopolitical reasons, while at the same time preserving the economic potential of the country. After attempting to implement that in 10 or 12 different major areas for those 5 years, each time seeing that it was going to be much, much more difficult and destabilizing than they had, seemed to have expected. They've fallen back away from taking those big steps forward. For example, center-local fiscal reform was started and simply not implemented. Likewise, renminbi internationalization, reducing the role of the property sector, all these kinds of things. And so, today, as he begins his third 5-year cycle term, He's got all the same economic problems that existed in 2013 and then some, because time has passed, the size of debts has built up. And now, rather than it being a few fringe economists suggesting that if this reform work doesn't get done, potential growth is going to fall from 5 or 6% to 2 or 3%, that is essentially where we are today. I mean, they'd be really lucky to say that it was as high as 3% in 2022. Probably much less than
But
that.
it's because just pause for a second. So you mentioned the property crackdown, and that you mentioned property, and that seems to be one area where he has
to de-risk, attempting to de-risk the property sector. Right, it was clear to anybody with eyes that the extent of debt building up in the property sector, a property sector that had become as much as 25% of all gross domestic product activity, was not sustainable, was imprudent, and could not be expected to be the engine of growth going forward the way it had been in the past, even if a soft landing could be engineered for the liabilities of the present. It was never going to play the same role in the future as it had from, say, 2011 to 2021. And so, yeah, I would characterize it that way rather than a crackdown on property, because, it's hard to say they're cracking down on something that they themselves were choosing to use for all those years. It's not like,
sorry. I mean, what is happening with property is just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, you were around 2014, 2015, where they took their first swing, and then and everything seemed to go wrong in the economy. When they're cranking up mortgage requirements, everything, you had this correction in prices and everything went south, and they were forced to kind of reverse themselves. And at that point, I think reasonably, a lot of the developers concluded that, like, hey, we're too big to fail now, right?
Right.
All we need to do is lever up as much as humanly possible. Like the more dangerous we are, the less they're likely to go after us. But I mean, they are going after them now. I mean, and it does seem like, at least in that area, he's willing to take a huge hit to economic growth. It's kind of a train wreck. I mean, on that area, do you see him easing up, or do you see him holding kind of a hard line?
Well, look, I think this is probably the most immediate theater for exploring this question of whether the most authoritarian leader can have everything his way in his economy, right? You have all this concentration of political power, as we were saying. There's no question that nothing that happens or doesn't happen will be a result of the leader not having enough power. You can't have more relative power than this guy now has, and yet an infinite amount of power, can it resolve the kind of financial risk that is laden in the property sector? My colleagues and I would argue that no, it cannot. It's an extraordinary tool, this political power that Xi and the party now have, but it simply is not the tool that can address a distributed, extended liability among hundreds of millions of people across the entirety of urban middle-class China, who have overinvested in a single asset in a single emerging market economy called China, and an asset called property, and on the assumption that this was never going to slow down, that the kind of extraordinary growth in the property sector was going to continue on for many years to come. And I think the sort of modern economic perspective on that was that supply and demand will ultimately impose themselves on that and put it to a test. And if there's not demand for additional property assets, or if the ability to constantly refinance themselves and roll over debt will come to an end at some point, at which time there will be a terrible reckoning, and it'll be revealed that even the most powerful government in the world and party behind it don't have the credibility to convince everyone that they can pay off all these liabilities without anybody experiencing a loss. And that was our thesis put out in as early as 2018. It was clear to us that this was near the end. In fact, in I think September 2018, we said there's at most 3 more years before the financial engineering around the property sector starts to come apart at the seams. And right on schedule, I think that was the month that Evergrande started to default on bonds and whatnot.
No, yeah, we've followed your work quite closely on the bit. Let me ask you, since you mentioned the word credibility, we stand back a little bit. So we had a lot of people that we spoke about, Liu He and these people that were kind of the face of credible market reform in China, and they are one of the things that happened during the Congress was these guys look like they're leaving the Central Committee, which indicates that they're, not only that their party roles, but their government roles are going to be deprecated. If not, they're just kind of on their way out. It does not look like there's a crew of equally trusted English-speaking technocrats coming in to replace them. We had this big market sell-off in the wake of the thing. But I mean, this is portfolio assets. These are people moving in and out of bonds and A shares. You guys have done a ton of work on direct investment, and that's where the story is a little bit harder to see. I can't tell anecdotally, if you ask Apple what they're doing and you ask Starbucks what they're doing, you hear very different stories, and the official data can be somewhat muddied by round trip investment, by, Chinese companies dressing up as foreigners going in. Can you just talk about how do you read foreign interest in parking money directly into China in terms of controlled managed assets and operating companies?
Yeah, and exactly as you note, Pete, the foreign direct investment, which entails multinationals and other entities building factories and things like that, those sorts of investment flows, can't turn around on a dime. So, nothing about what I have to say about those trends right now is reflective of the Congress itself, of course, right? I mean, it's reflective of overall trends over recent years, I would say, really. But a couple points on this. There are conflicting Chinese data sources on what today's pattern in foreign direct investment flows are. Ministry of Commerce numbers tell a story that they're at a record high level. People's Bank numbers, which strip out some of the noise, suggest that the picture's not quite that rosy. But I think regardless of which of those series, and even if you look at the more rosy MOFCOM numbers, what strikes me is that when you look at the inflow of foreign direct investment divided by the size of China's economy, FDI has been going down for well over a decade. The sort of foreign direct investment intensity of the economy, if you will, the amount of FDI relative to how big the economy is, has been changing in a subsiding direction for a very long time. Which is to say, I mean, my interpretation of that is that Beijing has not allowed foreign interest in being present in the economy to grow in tandem with the size of the underlying economy. As an economy gets bigger, you should expect more foreign investment, just like you expect more domestic investment from Chinese companies. If there's more consumer demand there, then firms from around the world are going to want to be part of that too. And so it's not enough that this year's inward FDI, let's say, is 150 billion or whatever it is relative to 140 billion last year. The question is, what's the footprint of foreign investment look like relative to how big the underlying Chinese economy is? And I think partly that can be ascribed to a reluctance of Beijing to finish opening the door to foreign direct investment inflows, especially in sectors involving data, of course, and services beyond the traditional areas. But partly too, I mean, and most recently, I think we're starting to detect an exasperation by many firms with the slow pace of reform and modernization, I dare say, in the Chinese economy, and a concern that ultimately that will result in dramatically slowing GDP growth rates. That the current, very, very tepid rate of growth might not just be a one-year COVID shock, but might be the new normal. especially if Xi Jinping and the new leadership don't choose to speak to it with more sense of urgency about the economic work that needs to be done to reach potential growth in the years ahead. So again, that's where we are, and I think that'll be the consequence if we don't see a more I think mindful economic package in terms of dealing with what currently ails the economy.
One final question. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about Xi has been his talk. The Chinese people need better lives, you know, and his desire to deprecate the importance of GDP, which is, you know, just one indicator, and it has its problems. And obviously, China has produced a very enormous amount of GDP figures that have gone places that have not been that productive.
Mhm.
If we talk about like a couple issues here, you mentioned the fiscal issue. It's notable that through all of this pandemic, China has still failed to kind of put through a massive package to upgrade its welfare benefit system, its healthcare system. The amount of handouts has been quite parsimonious. But he's talked about, you know, common prosperity, you know, something that panicked a bunch of investors, like, oh my God, here comes socialism and nobody's gonna buy Prada anymore. But like on balance, like if they have like high quality, low growth, is that bad a thing? I mean, if the GDP that used to go into building empty apartment buildings and roads to nowhere evaporates, at what point can China get by, you know, this massive economy at a lower rate?
I mean, you noted that you'd have to see a shift in investment flows away from overcapacity things that were low return, like more apartment blocks that nobody really wants at this point, toward things that people do need, like better healthcare services and things like that, right? So that is, how does that happen? You need really wholesale financial system reform, public expenditures reform, in order to make that structural adjustment in the basic architecture of the economy happen, right? And those are things that were anticipated by Xi and his team in 2013, and then they just found that implementing that was not going to be comfortable enough for them to stay the course, and so they fell away from it. Among the extraordinary challenges necessary to keep 1.4 billion people happy at a lower rate of growth is, at its heart, redistribution. Taking money from people who are very wealthy and through the intermediation of the state, redistributing it to people who don't have as much wealth, don't have as much economic opportunity. There are in China, let's remember, about 900 million people, as analysts like Scott Rozelle very compellingly tell us, right, who are waiting their turn, who are only making a few $1,000s a year perhaps, and are on the fringes of cities or in rural China, what have you, but are just not even close to living modern lives. They're not going to wait forever. Can we redistribute trillions of dollars of wealth and earnings away from urban Chinese to those 900 million Chinese to give them their turn? We could. It would require, for the very, very first move, would have to be something like property taxes to be paid by people who have wealth. And even that little first step is something which the Xi era has seen attempted several times, only to be deferred and pushed back further on the calendar because the social consequences of that for urban Chinese was too alarming and too concerning, and it led to anxiety about stability in the cities. Right. So yes, there's a way forward. And yes, socialism has a role to play in all of our societies. There's a little bit too much concentration of wealth worldwide, I would agree. But the hard work of policymaking to redesign the way that government and party function so that you can enduringly implement those changes, that is something which today's Beijing has just not yet demonstrated the ability to achieve. So I think the good news is they've already demonstrated that they understand that needs to happen. No matter what the growth rate is, we need a better apparatus of the state to handle things like redistribution in a more well-off society. That's the good news. The bad news is we've seen them try to do it and fall back from that challenge several times already, because it's there's no easy way to do it. Every rich country in the world today has had to go through some crises on the road from lower income levels to higher income levels. I don't think China will be an exception, but the leadership is still looking for some magic way that will allow them to get there without the same kinds of economic disruptions that unfortunately everybody else on the planet has had to go through en route. Yeah, I agree with you, Pete, that that the new crop of officials don't have the same track record of trying to implement market stuff. But on the other hand, the old crop, Liu He is the most commonly referenced name. They didn't succeed in implementing all that stuff the past decade either. So I'm not sure what the ideal technocrat is who can get the job done. And I am concerned as well that we haven't seen.
Yep. Is that? Do you think that people were deluded by these technocrats? I mean, you say that you saw, what Xi Jinping was going to be nearly a decade ago, that the signs were all there, and yet Liu He come in and make a speech about how after the technology crackdown and everything that, everything's fine, we're still committed to market reform, and markets pop up like 7% on the day. You have all these people who are desperately kind of looking for signs that we're going to go back to the old China. Please, can we get back to the pragmatic? If the illusions have been removed and we can now see exactly what we're dealing with on balance, isn't that better for investors than kind of being coddled in false hopes that behind Xi is some sort of pro-Western market reform mechanism that's still churning away?
Yeah, I mean, I have a somewhat idiosyncratic way of looking at all that and arguing through it. I don't think that markets are inherently Western. I think there's a 1,000-year Chinese tradition of understanding the role of markets in a society as well, and finding prices, and even the role of a strong central state in setting monetary policy for a kingdom. Has an extraordinary history in China. So I don't think these things are inherently Western. Of course, Anglo-American capitalism is definitely its own flavor, but there's lots of other flavors of market economics that one finds in the West, that one finds in Korea and Japan. And it really wasn't arm twisting from Washington or anywhere else that had inclined China after 1979 to reorient itself in a way that economic outcomes relied less on political commissars deciding what supply and demand should be, but instead letting private actors choose what crops are worth growing, bear risk, figure out what the demand and supply curves should look like in society in most areas. Right now, there was always, of course, an intention to maintain influence over the commanding heights of the economy, for all sorts of reasons, right? But that was, really, it was not a Western demand of China that it find its way to more market-oriented approach to figuring out what people should do when they get out of bed in the morning. After all, they had a good 30-year warm-up for that 1979 decision, where they had immiserated themselves to, on the eve of the 1979 third plenum, China was per capita 1/4 of the per capita income of Nicaragua in that year. That's how incredibly impoverished they had made themselves. And all leaders at the time, including Xi Jinping's father, understood how mistaken that had been, how erroneous that had been. So marketization and market reform was not at all just a Western construct. It has a Chinese tradition as well, and it will be a crucial part of the Chinese political economy in the future. The question is how many more years we're going to spend trying to find some magic way to avoid all the disruptions and challenges that come along with finishing the job of marketization. And I think we haven't seen our last market route on the journey to a more stable economic future. Let me just leave it there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're seeing one now. Well, look, Dan, that was great. Thanks so much for talking to us. I think that's all the time we have, so I'll wind us up. I'd like at this point to thank our listeners for tuning in, and shout out to our producers, Thomas Shum and Katrina Hamlin. Please do subscribe to the Exchange podcast and its sister podcast, The Views Room, on Megaphone, Spotify, or whatever podcast product you listen to. Catch up with our latest views and much more on breakingviews.com, and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @breakingviews. Thanks again, and take care.